episode 91 here at the Westminster Podcast Studio. I'm Nick Dixon here with Free Speech Renegade Toby Young. And coming up this week, Rishi's D-Day disaster, Europe swings to the right, and the full podcast available on basedmedia.org. Quick apology for last week's sound issue. We did our best. There was a bit of an issue there. It was all Toby's fault, so you can direct complaints to Toby. It is actually your fault, Toby, because I want to give the producers more time. You impose strict deadlines, so therefore it is your fault. And the other thing is there was a hard drive issue, which came from the hard drive being full from your other podcast, because you bizarrely launched a rival podcast competing against our own podcast with almost an identical name. I wasn't going to mention it, but it's so absurd. If people are wondering what's going on with that, I don't know either. But as a Zen exercise, I've just let it go so it doesn't bother me because it's so ridiculous.
Doesn't sound like a wholly successful exercise. To your first point, I think because a lot of the issues we discuss in this podcast are topical, stolen from the headlines, that we want to get the podcast out as soon as possible because topical material has such a short shelf life. We're still discussing that issue. Hasn't been resolved.
And my claim is it's a weekly podcast, so nothing can be totally topical. So an extra day for the producers will be better. See, to be totally transparent, that's the debate. Go on.
That is the debate. And on the other point, we've launched a new podcast on the Daily Sceptic called The Sceptic. It's partly because this podcast became so detached from the Daily Sceptic. I mean, basically, it's just we've turned it into something else. It's spun off into something else. We've set up a wholly independent company. And there are lots of opportunities to talk to our contributors on the Daily Sceptic. We've got a lot of interesting people with lots to say. So it made sense to launch another podcast, which is strictly dedicated to discussing all the articles, all the content in the Daily Sceptic. So I should tell...
Not a wholly independent. I mean, they still own part of this chunk of this thing. Therefore, they're launching a competing product against themselves. I mean, I could probably take you to court.
It's not a competing product, exactly. It's released on a different day, and the material is wholly different.
Okay, but people have asked me, so I don't know what's going on either.
Well, I think it should make it clear, though, that premium subscribers to the Weekly Sceptic don't get access to the premium version of The Sceptic, the new Daily Sceptic podcast, and vice versa. I think we've had a few emails, queries from people who think that if they subscribe to the premium version of one, then they'll be able to access the premium version of the other, and complaining that they can't. But they're two wholly separate podcasts produced by two separate companies.
Okay. What if that's because you've given it an almost identical name?
Well, The Sceptic,
they could
the
be
Weekly
forgiven
Sceptic,
for making that mistake, couldn't they?
Well, of course they could be forgiven for making the mistake, but that's why I thought it important to clarify that.
Okay, good.
One other thing I should say is we are launching, I think the plan is to launch the premium version of the Sceptic on the Daily Sceptic's website this week, this Thursday. Thursday's the day that podcast comes out. But we're also launching some other products for people who donate to the Daily Sceptic, donate £5 or more a month. So if you donate £5 to The Sceptic, not only do you access the premium version of the Sceptic podcast, but you can also access some articles we're putting behind a paywall. We're also creating a Discord server where people can discuss the contents of the articles on the Daily Sceptic with their authors, with the editors, etc.
Okay, but Toby's plugging that then as a totally separate thing. And while we're doing that, go to nickdixon.net for my separate thing, which is the current thing, full episodes of the current thing with people like Carl Benjamin. Just did one with Pete North. Got some great ones coming up. And we have one with Graham Linehan, and they're all available as well as all my articles at nickdixon.net.
So it's okay for you to have a wholly different podcast, but not me.
Well, with an identical name.
It's not identical.
Mine's interviews, and it's a completely different name, and it's interviews. It's not a competing product.
Oh, the Sceptic is interviews too.
Okay.
But it's interviews with authors of articles in the Daily Sceptic. But it is just interviews.
All right.
It's not like this. It's not commentary.
I haven't watched it. So I assume it's different. Okay, good. We sorted that out.
I did watch.
I like to be totally transparent with the listeners and viewers.
I think it's important to clarify.
Yeah, I think
how these are two different podcasts.
Very different, with very different names. So, get that done. Should we move on and do the actual stories? I think that's everything plugged. And obviously, you can get the full version of this at basedmedia.org. And by the way, the fade out at the end, I did want to make that more gentle. Sorry to everyone who feels like, we're just cutting it off. We're just finding ways to do this and finding ways to survive. Please be patient with us. And we're just finding ways to, make everyone happy. I'm currently making everyone unhappy, but we still have a loyal listenership. We don't, right? I suppose the squeaky wheels are the ones that we hear from who have the complaints, but there's all the loyal thousands of people listening in silence. So thanks to those. And Someone said I mentioned my health too much. Haven't mentioned it for ages, guys. But thanks to the person that said I should stop drinking Coke. I've already actually cut out all Coke and all chocolate and sugar, but I don't want to talk too much about it because we've got the people who get irate when I mention anything personal. They want me to just be a news-producing robot. So with that in mind, let's crack on. Speaking of news-producing robots, the quite robotic Rishi Sunak, a.k.a. Rashid Sunak, who got in a lot of trouble about D-Day. And it's a little bit old as we record, but we do need to cover it. It's a massive story. Obviously, you'll know he was there for the domestic part, but he buggered off for the international part, thinking, I've basically got the idea. They've seen me now. Really sort of like, I've shown my face. Like a kind of a party you don't want to go to. Like, I've popped my head around the door. They've seen I'm here. What can they do about it? And he went off to do an ITV pre-recorded interview thing. And obviously, this was disastrous and mad and just shows his complete lack of political instinct. Farage said it shows his lack of grasp of the culture. Of course, for the left, they can say he's just completely out of touch. It's a disaster all around. Big question is, what was he thinking? Does he just have zero political instincts? Is he just a managerial type? Just doesn't think like that. He thinks, okay, I've got this to do, I've got this to do, get it all done. Very sort of utilitarian. I don't think it necessarily means he's a bad guy. Anyone thinks he's a bad guy or thick or anything. He's obviously smart. So the question is, why would he do something like that? And why would Cameron, as my second question, be so involved? He was there in all the pictures. Biden, Olaf Scholz, Macron, and then Cameron. And you're going like, okay, has Cameron stitched him up here and said, oh yeah, you go ahead, don't worry, I'll be in all the really important pictures. And or an alternative theory some people were putting to me on Twitter, is Rishi fine with that? Is Cameron being kind of set up as some sort of continuity person in the party? Maybe he's going to be the next leader even, or something. I don't know how that would work, but what do you think, Tony, of that?
I think, well, there was quite a good piece by Tim Shipman in the Sunday Times about what went wrong. According to according to Rishi Sunak's aides, this final event on Thursday.
If he has AIDS, that's a good reason to leave. Can I just... I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Well, that's what I'm here for. I bring the comedy. Carry on. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I stopped for a second. I thought, don't say it, Nick, and then I had to say it.
According to his political advisors, quoted off the record in this piece by Tim Shipman in the Sunday Times, they were led to believe that this was very much a kind of B-list event. It was a tail-end event. Biden wasn't going to be there. Starmer wasn't going to be there. So he sent along David Cameron to be there in his place, and he rushed back to London, apparently not to do an interview with Paul Brand on ITV, but to sign off the final version of the Conservative manifesto at 6 p.m. on Thursday. And they shoehorned in this interview with Paul Brand, the ITV interview.
Are they just saying the manifesto because it sounds better now, or is that the truth?
That was what they said. That's what some of these. I mean, they're obviously all trying to kind of escape blame, and there's a kind of circular firing squad, and it's a shit show. So who knows whether they're telling the truth? But there was an interesting bit in this article about David Lammy's manoeuvrings, and it looked as though Lammy had effectively sucked up to, ingratiated himself with Macron by saying nice things, tweeting in French, contributing essays to Parisian intellectual magazines. I guess preparing to be, the leader of a kind of détente between France and the UK once Labour formed the government and Lammy's the foreign secretary. But according to this, Lammy played a blinder. Starmer wasn't initially invited, and that's why Sunak thought, well, I don't need to go either, particularly if he didn't think Biden was going to be there. But then because of this good relationship Lammy had built up with the Elysee, he managed to get, at the last minute, wangle an invitation to Starmer, didn't tell Sunak. They kept that deadly secret. So then there'd be this horrific, embarrassing photo of, the final part of the D-Day commemorations, which Sunak wasn't present at. So in a sense, he was just kind of outmaneuvered by David Lammy, which in some ways is even more embarrassing than not turning up to the commemorations.
He tends to always be outmaneuvered politically, but and was he outmaneuvered by Well, I'll ask the Cameron thing in a second. I just want to check as well. There was a tweet from the French, wasn't there, that he was always not going to be there, they were told. So maybe that's because they didn't see it as this important thing.
Yeah.
And so what about the Cameron aspect then? Why was Cameron knocking around there in all these pictures?
I think Sunak's team thought it was a B-list event, so they sent along a second in command rather than the general.
But it's sneaky from Cameron, because he's already known, there was a whole article about this, as the sort of PM abroad. He's known as the international PM. Like in America, in Europe, they see him as the Prime Minister still, in this weird thing, because Rishi's brought him back obviously in a different capacity, but he's just seen that way.
Yeah.
So it's the last thing you want is that guy in all the photos with Biden. You know, if you want to still be PM, but no one's sure Rishi actually does.
According to this insider piece by Tim Shipman, Cameron was furious that Rishi had asked him to sub for him. He thought Rishi should have been there. And when Cameron made his conference speech in 2014 when he was PM, he said that the high point of the year for him had been attending the 70th anniversary D-Day commemorations. And apparently in private, when talking to one of his own speechwriters about the speech he was going to give at that event 10 years ago, he said, "I might cry during this bit because I find it all so moving and overcoming." So seemingly Cameron does care and was really cross that Sunak appeared not to.
Wow, interesting. I didn't know Cameron cared about stuff. Okay, so he actually didn't even want to be there. I find it unlikely he didn't want to be there in all these pictures looking important, but maybe I'm too cynical. I mean, it's...
Maybe they thought it was kind of like, a non-aggression pact with Labour. If you're not going to be there, then I don't have to be there, and we're all so busy.
Yeah, because Starmer, as usual, gets away with looking basically patriotic. No one thinks he's really patriotic, but he does the basics. He stands next to the flag. He's actually there. And one thing, I don't know if he changed this later, but one thing I noticed in the immediate aftermath was he was not using it against Sunak. Maybe because all this stuff might come out, or just he just didn't want to. It was because it was people like Ed Davey were jumping on it, going, "I was there," and well, I didn't think D-Day's important. Sunak, and they was jumping on it. And there is a sort of, well, Farage, it's a bit more sincere because he's actually raised 100,000, as he pointed out, and with the taxis and so on. And he genuinely cares. Whereas Ed Davey, to me, it felt like he's just going, "I care and you don't," Sunak. But it seemed like Starmer was doing the deliberately sort of classy thing of not jumping on it. And then he said, just like, "You'll have to ask him." Like, he didn't really jump on it as a political football because that would have looked tacky. Was that what was going on there?
Maybe he just. I mean, in a way, it was better to kind of leave it to the others to attack Sunak. It wasn't like anyone was going to miss it. He didn't need to weigh in. And as you say, he looked kind of statesmanlike and dignified by not kind of trying to score points off of Rishi for failing to turn up.
But the fundamental problem is just that Rishi didn't realise how important it was, and whatever reason you want to attribute that to. And look, obviously D-Day is hugely important, but I understand. I'm not the kind of person who wants to sit through long events in general, but I'm not a politician. That's a large part of the job. He doesn't seem to grasp still. He seems to think of it as, in a way, it's admirable that he thinks of it as being very balanced, that he thinks of it as, let's get the job done, let's do the important work, and it's basically a managerial task these days, and he understands that to an extent. But then if he doesn't do all that, I mean, Cummings liked him initially because he was a kind of high IQ, hard-working person who didn't really like the other side of politics. But if you can't do that side, you're in trouble. I mean, Farage is a natural at these big gesture things. He's perfect at that, and Boris was good at that. Whereas that's the thing that Rishi just doesn't seem to have at all.
He just seems to have no grasp at all of the theatre of politics, the ceremonial dimension, why he made his general election announcement in the pouring rain outside Downing Street. He seems to have a real blind spot about that.
Ideally, he'd morally care about D-Day, but in lieu of that, you'd think he'd grasp the theatre aspect as a second.
But it's if not him, then his aides. I mean, quite extraordinary. Until that point, I mean, I think I held out some vestige of hope that the polls might narrow and the Tories wouldn't be completely wiped out in this general election.
I'm hoping for the opposite, but you're still hoping for...
Well, I still retain some vestige of loyalty for the party.
And we do have some Conservatives listening, so I apologise to our friends who are listening, who are, people like Lord Frost. I don't want anything bad to happen to them, but I do kind of want the Tories to be destroyed partly as well, but go on.
Anyway, so that shred of hope has now gone, and I'm now just thinking about who the next leader of the party is going to be, and we can talk about that actually in a minute when we get onto the debates.
Well, we can.
But I think it was considered such a colossal error that there were rumours circulating on Sunday that on Saturday night, in fact, that Sunak was going to fall on his sword, actually resign and say, "I can no longer lead this party into the general election campaign. You'll have to pick someone else." And how would that have worked? Would King Charles even have accepted his resignation? Could he have refused to accept it? I mean, it would have been very destabilising, constitutionally unprecedented. It would have plunged Britain into crisis, I think. Anyway, he's not doing that, which is a relief.
I think Cameron would have just stepped in somehow. But
then would he? But then Cameron couldn't have been Prime Minister if the Conservatives had won the election because he's a Lord.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe someone else, Penny, would have stepped in or something.
Well, it might have been a huge bun fight as to who would step in if they were then going to be the Prime Minister, in the very unlikely event that the Tories actually won enough seats.
Yeah.
But that would have been, horrible mess.
Another little note was that Ian Aitchison, an advisor to Michael Gove, quit over the D-Day thing. And he said, it revealed to me that while I still embrace a conservative philosophy, I'm no longer willing to have it outsourced to a bunch of mendacious, incompetent and disreputable clowns. So that was the kind of language we were seeing, pretty brutal. It was brutal for poor old Rashid Sunak. But then, which I never tire of saying, I'm sorry, it was Biden that originally said it. I just find it amusing.
What about Biden at the D-Day commemorations?
Oh, yeah, Biden. I mean, the question is, did he or didn't he? So there was a moment where he bent down in a really weird, stiff way and then kind of got back up again slowly. And people were saying, okay, did he defecate, to put it nicely, or was he trying to sit in an imaginary chair was the more reasonable one? And people immediately on the internet started calling him Poopin' Joe. And we were like, I can't wait till Trump starts launching that. Poopin' Joe, they call him Poopin' Joe because he poops. Folks, whatever. But Poopin' Joe is a new name. But the more generous interpretation was he thought there was a chair, and actually I've heard that it was not too far off, so it wasn't that bad that he was looking for this chair. We've all done it. Right. What do you think?
Biden is just becoming more embarrassing by the day. I mean, did you see his performance at the Juneteenth ceremony or whatever it was, celebration? There was some gospel music, and all the people around him, Kamala Harris and so forth, were all kind of, dad dancing to this music. And Biden was just standing there completely stiff, looking straight ahead. I mean, really sort of spookily immobile. He looked like a waxwork dummy. It was like, it was bizarre. But he was clearly in some kind of fugue state. It was an episode of some kind. And the guy next to him, this sort of black preacher, puts his arm around him and tries to kind of subtly shake him back into reality. And you can see Biden kind of gradually waking up, looking around, and then smiling at this guy as if to say, "Who are you? You look nice." I've missed that. And I think there is a chance that he may not be the Democratic presidential nominee. At the convention, something may happen. I mean, obviously, he's protected by the fact that his number 2 is Kamala Harris, and there is a constitutional mechanism in the United States for her to succeed him. But
they may pivot to the hologram, just bring in the hologram Biden scene. Because the other moment at the D-Day was when he was standing there, and there was Macron and his wife, and there was someone else, I can't remember. I think it was, anyway. And Biden just started slowly turning for no reason. They completely turned around the other way.
Completely randomly.
And then they sort of looked at him and went, and then they started turning.
They covered for him by turning in the same direction. Yeah.
They're like, why is he doing it? Oh, let's all turn. It's like meerkats or something. It looked ridiculous. But Biden, absolute madness. But one quick other thing. So do you want to, that's pretty much the D-Day thing. Do you want to move on to sort of the general manifestos and the other parties?
Yeah.
Because there was one thing, you mentioned the Tories being obliterated. And maybe I should just briefly mention this in the Daily Mail, that Reform overtakes Tories among over 55s in latest poll. So Reform have just been crushing in the polls. And then Farage did that little announcement. They sort of talked about debt and tax and things like that. And the other big thing that's happened today as we record is someone has attacked Farage. This guy's a 28-year-old man's been arrested. He was throwing stuff at Farage on the bus as he went past the open-top bus, grabbing it from a construction site. Wet cement, apparently. Farage thought stones had been thrown. We already had the milkshake, which was happening just as we recorded last week. And by the way, this stuff is disgusting. If you're throwing milkshake at a politician, I mean, in some countries they just cut off your hand and then never have to do anything again. I mean, that's one solution. Stick them in prisons. Another one, more moderate solution. But I think it's completely disgusting. And I said I'm just gonna. People love it when I read my own tweets, but I'll just give a gist of what I said today. And this will be, I suppose when we record this will be yesterday, but when it comes out, sorry. But I said, with the BBC calling Reform far right and members of the Home Office allegedly advocating violence against Farage, attacks like this are inevitable. They want their political opponents in physical danger. Can you really disagree with that? Because doesn't it create the environment for that? This whole incitement, people call it stochastic terrorism, I've heard. And by the way, the Home Office was a reference to a piece from Stephen Edgington, where he said, a whistleblower in the Home Office had said that there was people in there saying Farage should be arrested. Didn't surprise me at all, of course, because I've heard a couple of my blob friends say that Jacob Rees-Mogg should be arrested. Then one even advocated violence against him. They laughed at the milkshake thing. Not surprising given what you know about these people. But so, Toby, any comment on all that?
Well, yeah, I'm slightly wary of trying to restrict speech on the grounds that it could lead to violence. That, for me, is too low a bar, too loose a standard. You have to be able to show that it's going to lead to imminent violence, I think, in order to justify curtailing it. And this is actually a line in the Lib Dem manifesto, exposing and confronting the stereotyping, demagoguery and hate speech in public life and the media that inflames hatred and leads to spikes in hate crimes. So they're suggesting, in fact, that people they're not thinking for a second that the people who are going to be harmed by hate speech are people like Farage. They're thinking that people like Farage are going to speak in a hateful way, and that's going to endanger the safety of minorities. That's why they talk about stereotyping and demagoguery and bracket that with hate speech. But I'd be a bit reluctant to, limit what people can say about how much they dislike Farage for fear that you could employ the same metric to limiting what people can say about Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, I think Ed Dutton put it well in a reply to my tweet. He said, if we're going to have anti-free speech laws on incitement, it should be a crime to call someone Nazi, far-right extremist, or any synonym for these words, or even better, abolish anti-free speech laws. So I think that's the point. If we're going to have it, we have to have it for the other side as well to protect them. But you're saying just scrap it all.
Well,
unless it's direct, and the American Constitution has that as well. If it's direct incitement, like on the spot, get that guy.
Yeah, the American Constitution, the First Amendment standard is that speech. Not child pornography, not betraying state secrets, not libel, but within those limits, any speech should be permitted, as long as it's not going to lead to imminent lawless action. And that's the First Amendment standard, and that is just the American version of the English common law breach of the peace principle, which is that we should, within the same limits, be allowed to say whatever we like, as long as it's not going to lead to a breach of the peace. That's people talk about the need for an English First Amendment, but actually the American First Amendment, that's just the American version of the English common law breach of the peace principle, and that's my kind of bottom line. And I think if you could prove that there was a connection between, if there'd been someone standing next to the guy saying, Nigel Farage is a fascist, you should throw a stone at him and try and kill him, and then he did it, then the guy standing next to him could be done. I think that would be fine. But just if you say just people, the BBC calling reform far right has led to this, and that shouldn't be allowed, I think that would be too nebulous a standard.
Okay. So you mentioned the Lib Dem manifesto. Do you want to get on to that, or do you want to do the Conservative manifesto, which, as we record, has just come out? But it's quite boring. It's about tax and 2p off national insurance and stuff. Which do you want to tackle?
We could do. The Lib Dem one is madder than the Conservative one by some distance. We could do the Conservative one first.
Do the Conservative one. It's quite dull, but I'm hoping you can give us the bullet points. Well, the 2p national insurance was the sort of. That's meant to be the big reveal. There wasn't really a big thing. It was very Sunak. It was very much like more sensible stuff. Nothing big. Nothing that's going to save him in the election. Yeah,
it was going to be. Today the big reveals when the Conservatives finally launched their manifesto were, as you say, cut to national insurance by a further 2p, taking it down to 6% by April 27, and taking a further, I think, 4 million people, self-employed people, out of national insurance, so they don't have to pay national insurance anymore. What else did he say? On net zero, he promised to cut the cost for consumers. But most of it, I think most of their big policy commitments they'd already revealed, like national service, boosting defence spending by 2.5%, the triple lock plus for pensioners, and so forth. They said today that they're going to impose a legal cap on migration, which will fall every year. I don't think people take what the Tories say about wanting to reduce migration seriously, because they've said it at every general election campaign now since 2010 and never managed to do it.
A Spectator described it as, they said his speech today was a recognition of the fact that he is not going to be able to turn around a 20-point deficit with 3 weeks to go. Instead, it was a careful, credible pitch to that minority of voters who have not yet made up their minds about the Tories. Would you say that was about right?
It seems like they're pivoting to damage control now. Their policies are designed to appeal much more to people thinking about voting Lib Dem or Labour in the southeast, the southwest, the home counties, rather than trying to win back those red wall voters who already seem to be gone in the Labour column now.
I mean, can you even damage control it at this point? I mean, I suppose they're just trying to save the party at this point. But they've had some mad advertising. I mean, Emma Webb shared something from Conservatives paid for by the Conservative Party. So is this a Facebook ad maybe? And it said, Reform can't win any seats, but they can help Keir Starmer win. Do you really want to hand Starmer a blank check? And then it just has this picture with like a massive Labour majority. I mean, I don't know. It's just a weird, I don't know. They moved into very kind of negative territory. I mean, they're just, like you say, damage control. I mean, Reform could actually take over, couldn't they? Soon we're going to at least have a poll that says that soon.
Well, the moment at which Reform are ahead of the Conservatives will be a big moment in the campaign. Could happen. It's not guaranteed.
It's coming.
Yeah, and we should talk about whether, assuming Nigel Farage wins, I know this is one of your favourite topics, if Farage wins his seat on the 8th attempt this time round, is it possible that he'll be a contestant for the Conservative Party leadership in the immediate aftermath of the election? It was interesting that Suella Braverman said he should be welcomed back into the party, and Kemi Badenoch said, no, I wouldn't allow him back into the party. I think the context of that is that Suella's saying effectively, I want him to rejoin the party as soon as he gets elected, so he can be a contestant. He can be the right-wing contestant in the forthcoming Conservative leadership election. And the reason Kemi says no, he shouldn't be allowed back into the party is because she recognises that if he is the right-wing contestant, she won't be his candidate. She won't be. So she doesn't want to let him back in.
Well, there's also that argument, someone's actively trying to destroy your party, you shouldn't allow them back in.
Yeah. But I think at that stage, the pitch would be, Farage's pitch would be, I'm the only person who can save your party. It wouldn't be, let me in so I can destroy it. It would be, I'm the only person who can win back these votes that you lost to Reform in the election.
Yes, but because now he's actively campaigning to destroy it. I mean, I've heard some people say that. That's all. But
I think thinking about it, I've written about this in The Spectator this week. The argument against making Farage the leader of the party, and I think it could be a genuine debate following the election, will be, yes, he'll be able to win back that 20-25% of people who voted Conservative in 2019 who voted Reform this time. He'll be able to win those back in a heartbeat, but he might struggle to win back the 20% who've defected, the 20% of 2019 Tory voters who've gone to Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens. And it seems to be about 20% at the moment. It might increase, it might fall a bit between now and the election. But the argument against Farage will be, yes, you can galvanise the Conservative base. You can unite the right of the party and Reform and attract maybe 30% of the electorate by doing that. We discussed this last week. But you won't be able to win back. In fact, you'll be kryptonite to those defectors, those Conservative refugees who've gone over to Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens. And it'll make it harder for us to win them back. What we need is a more moderate right-wing leader who can win back some of the people who've voted Reform and some of the people who voted Labour and Lib Dem, particularly as Labour gets more unpopular in the run-up to the 29 election. So that'll be the argument, I think. Can Farage win enough of the people who've gone in the other direction, not in his direction, if he's the leader, compared to someone like Kemi? There's one wrinkle to this, Nick, which you may not be aware of. I only heard about it last night, which is that Boris apparently secretly hopes that Farage will win in Clacton and then be readmitted to the Conservative Party. Boris's plan is then to get back in himself, get a seat himself at the earliest opportunity so he can participate in the leadership election. And his pitch will be, you have to put me forward as one of the final two up against Farage when the vote goes to the members, because I'm the only person who in a vote of the members could beat Nigel Farage. Make me your nominee so I can save the party from Farage. But we won't be able to make that pitch unless Farage both wins in Clacton and is readmitted to the party. So he's got a kind of secret ally for completely Machiavellian reasons in the form of Boris, who apparently hasn't given up and still imagines he's going to come roaring back on his white Charger to rescue the party.
That seems a very Boris belief. Where have you got that from? Is that secret information?
Got it. It's sort of rumours, not from a particularly good source.
Okay, I saw Boris the other day doing a little video with kind of a stubble and kind kind of wild hair. He actually looked quite good though. So maybe he is thinking it, because he always loses weight when he's thinking of coming back, doesn't he?
He looks a bit like when Schwarzenegger has a beard. He's got the kind of little white kind of sort of
blonde beard.
Blonde beard, yeah.
But it actually looked quite good. I was thinking he looks better than he has for a while. Probably suits him to just be swanning around doing incredibly overpaid speeches and just not really doing much. Yeah. You probably would look good, wouldn't you?
Well, I did hear from one good source, actually, that he definitely hasn't abandoned his political ambitions and thinks he's going to come back and lead the party and save the nation from Keir Starmer.
Interesting. I don't know. I mean, I'm up for the Farage takes over the party in very much the way Trump's taken over the Republicans. Very hard to launch a new party, although Reform are doing so well, maybe they even do become the new party. Very hard to launch a new party, but you can take over the existing one. But I do understand your argument about the glass ceiling of Farage, or whatever you call it, the Farage ceiling. And so maybe you need someone else. I mean, in a way, Trump dealt with that by having the seriousness of someone like Bannon behind him. And they were always looking for a figurehead. It started with Palin, and then they were like, okay, it's Trump. So you can, to some degree, adapt a figure like Trump and make him do different things because he doesn't understand the policy necessarily. So you could do that with Farage. Farage probably more of an understanding of policy than Trump, perhaps you might argue. Although Trump's good on some things like trade, but you could argue they could do that with Farage, but it will always be perceived in a certain way. Therefore, it has to be someone else. And you have to have figures like Genrick there, who seems to be the most serious guy around, but he's maybe not the leader. Are you proposing a kind of Genrick with Kemi as leader? I know you're obsessed with Kemi.
Yeah, no, I still think I still prefer Kemi to Genrick, partly because I don't know much about Genrick.
I'm proposing Genrick as helping
as a
behind
deputy.
the scene. Yeah, that's what I'm proposing.
Second in command.
But I'm still proposing
Farage.
Farage. I obviously want something different for you. I want Farage to come in with a wrecking ball and just crush it all. I mean, we can get into this in the Europeans, really, but it's incredible how well Reform are doing with basically nothing, with no real policies yet. They're starting to get their policies, no real infrastructure. They're having various little problems of a new party that a new party is bound to have. But even so, they're doing incredibly well. And maybe we'll get into this later with the guy in Spain who's doing well, who's basically an influencer, who's managed to get seats in the European elections just with nothing, just based on the message of the status quo isn't working, and his party's called like the party's over. It's this hatred of the establishment and how badly it's gone wrong. The progressive, liberal, globalist, managerial class that is now falling apart. And maybe I'll rue the day I say this because it's going to be more unstable for the world when this thing falls apart. But it has to fall apart because it's so arrogant. It's such a failure. It's not doing anything for people, and it's just not delivering. And it's become woke now as well. So people just despise it. And the getting rid of the Tories is part of that message. Now we've got this strange thing in this country where we still want Labour, but we should get into that in the next section because it's a question of why are we going left when the rest of Europe's going right. But that's later. While we're talking about Reform, I just want to quickly mention this story, probably get myself in trouble. The Reform candidate Ian Gribbin, who is in trouble for some comments very much taken out of context. But one of them was that we should have taken Hitler up on his offer of neutrality instead of fighting the Nazis. And this is being sold as like he's a Nazi. But actually, the position, of course, was the normal position at the time of Lord Halifax. You only got to watch Darkest Hour, and of course Chamberlain, and it was very much that was a normal position. And lots of historians have said, I know it's a slightly controversial position, obviously for obvious reasons, but historians have said, some historians, well, we destroyed the empire, we gave up power to America, weren't in a position to fight this war, and maybe we didn't need to, and we could have avoided. That's not that radical. I think maybe even Hitchens says something similar in The Phony War, but I haven't read it, so maybe I shouldn't go around saying that and get in trouble.
Well, there are certainly some historians who take that line even now, and some apologists for Halifax. But I think it was a much easier position to argue for in 1940, before we knew about the Holocaust, when perhaps we thought Hitler was someone who would respect international alliances and treaties. Much harder to argue for that position now, I think.
Yeah, but I think this assumes the Holocaust would happen either way, and I think so, because that was not why we went to war. Yeah, exactly, and it wasn't
underway at that
exactly.
point.
So it wasn't why we went to war. So it doesn't.
Well, it might have made. I'm not saying that it would have had an impact on the Holocaust, but knowing what we know now about how evil Hitler was, it's harder to make the argument for.
Yeah, I can see that.
Suing for peace.
But I think it's not as outrageous as they're making it sound. And the other thing they're saying is that he said this, he's called women the sponging gender. But if you actually look at what he said men pay 80% of tax. Women spend 80% of tax revenue. On aggregate as a group, you only take from society. Less complaining, please, from the sponging gender. isn't that just banter? Isn't that Clarkson-esque banter in context? And it was said a while ago. They make it sound like he's just come out now and said Hitler's great and I hate women. But really, it's a controversy. Isn't that a Toby Young-esque article? Couldn't you write that in The Spectator?
About women being... I don't think I've ever said
you wouldn't write that
quite
too much of a cut, but you wouldn't because you're too worried about being a misogynist. But it's banter, though, isn't it?
When did he say it?
That was in some piece. When was that? This was the... Well, I don't know, because I have to find out. Because it was the previous month from the other... Oh, yeah, here we go. It was on the Unheard website in 2022. He said the Hitler thing, and the month before he had said the women thing.
Comment?
In the comments. So he's just there commenting, mouthing off on the Unheard
was it hope
comment
not hate
section.
Going through the comments?
Probably, because they've already set up... That's why I don't give in to these people. They're all just trying to...
Well, I mean, it's one of the things the Free Speech Union is campaigning for is a statute of limitations on what you can be cancelled for. You can only go back a year and no further to stymie groups like Hope Not Hate and other offence archaeologists who trawl through everything you've said or written, tweeted, in the form of comments, whatever, looking for something to cancel you for. So it shouldn't be able to go back longer than a year. So in that respect, then, yes, I don't think he should be cancelled.
And as we record, Tice has been defending him and Gribben has apologised. So, but let's see. Hopefully, I just think we have to stand up to these people and just not cancel candidates almost as a default position. It seems like they're getting a bit tougher on that because they haven't got rid of him immediately like they've done in the past. Just wanted to mention that quickly. So this Lib Dem manifesto... It's kind of funny to talk about. I mean, who cares about the Lib Dem manifesto? But one notable thing, the most notable thing, was that they want to go back in the single market. And they said in the Mail it was buried 4 pages from the end of the document. And so that's the only noteworthy thing, that we want to go back into Europe, admitting what all the blob wants to do anyway. And I suppose it gives them something. Because before this, I was thinking, what are the Lib Dems' policies? I mean, imagine voting Lib Dem in 2024. How deranged do you have to be? I mean, they're completely pointless and they're far left. And now they want to go back into the... And the irony, of course, is that they want to go back into an increasingly right-wing Europe. Yeah. So that's the other irony.
Yes. It's so far, it looks to be the wokest of the manifestos. And it is just extraordinarily woke. It's as though it was written by, all the under 25-year-olds who work for The Guardian. I mean, they want to make misogyny a hate crime. They want to make diversity targets mandatory for employers. They want every large company to be forced to make a formal statement of corporate purpose, including what they want to do about employee welfare, environmental standards, community benefit, and ethical practice. They want to create a new online crime agency that, among other things, would police the internet for incitements to violence. They want to require all football clubs to have equality, diversity, and inclusion action plans. I mean, most of them do already. They want to require large employers to monitor and publish data on gender, ethnicity, disability, and LGBT plus employment levels, pay gaps and progressions, publish 5-year aspirational diversity targets, ban all forms of conversion therapies and practices. So that would effectively criminalise parents trying to talk their gender-confused children out of having irreversible medical procedures. I've said the bit about hate crimes. One of the more laughable bits, Nick, was support the BBC both to provide impartial news and information and to take a leading role in increasing media literacy and educating all generations in tackling the impact of fake news. It's as though BBC Verify, in the eyes of Lib Dem, has been a resounding success, and the BBC should be given even more responsibility for helping poor, credulous dupes like us distinguish between real news and fake news.
Amazing. And they also want US-style cannabis shops. Did you mention that one? So they want everyone hopped up on goofballs, as that was a Simpsons quote, but they want everyone just smoking weed. The other thing is, did you mention this one? Removing the requirement for medical reports before changing gender. And that's a massive one.
So it's going to become much easier to change your legal gender. They want to force, they've said that they want to effectively implement Leveson in full, which means forcing all newspapers and magazines to sign up to the state press regulator, Impress. We all know where that leads. This was a good one. They want to increase council tax on second homes by 500%. And their rationale for this is so they can pay their fair share. In what universe is it fair to increase someone's council tax by 500% overnight? And, this is on second homes. People who have second homes, they use less of the kind of facilities paid for by the council than people who have first homes in a particular area. So how is it fair that they should pay 5 times as much? It's just ludicrous.
Yeah, who are they? Who is their voter? It seems to me it's a kind of blob person who's desperate to go back into the EU, which is most of these blob people, and they're in a seat where Labour can't win, so they're going to strategically vote Lib Dem, and they don't care about all the woke stuff because they either endorse it or they're kind of blind to it. I mean, is that their vote? I mean, because it's such a radical manifesto in a sense.
You'd think in winnable seats for the Lib Dems like Sutton and Cheam, this stuff isn't going to go down too well, particularly not the stuff about a 500% tax, council tax increase on second homes. There are probably a lot of second home owners in Sutton and Cheam. It's so radical, so woke. You would have thought it would actually hinder their hopes of winning, 60 or so MPs in the next parliament.
But people don't care about that. I mean, a lot of the normies don't care about woke or they like it. I mean, I think people just continue to strategically vote for them to get rid of the Tories, and this just won't affect it either way. Well, I doubt they'll even look at their manifesto. They'll just
Probably not.
Okay, let's vote against.
And what do you think of Ed Davey's strategy of kind of falling off paddle boards and going on roller coasters? It's sort of, if they want to be taken seriously as a kind of credible political party, why is he engaging in these kind of stunts that go wrong? It's like trying to manufacture things that would just organically go wrong for Boris and win him a lot of attention. Is it that they think this is the only way we can attract any media attention at all by committing a series of kind of large-scale kind of gaffes, which will amuse the media and they'll come to laugh and stay to discuss our commitment to raise council tax on second homes by 500%.
Yeah, my guess is, just thinking out loud, it is that, and it's also to just promote Ed Davey as a personality because no one knows who he is. But when it was Paddy Ashdown, everyone knew who he was. He was quite an important figure in politics, and he was a sort of major figure. Whereas now the Lib Dems, ever since they sort of collapsed, I mean, even Nick Clegg was a fairly major figure. Post the coalition, they never have been. I mean, Tim Farron was there. He was a beloved local MP where I'm from. Unfortunately, they got rid of him because he was a Christian. So since then, I mean, and even I suppose Cable was a somewhat bigger figure, but the leaders have been dwindling in seriousness. Joe Swinson being a complete joke, and now Ed Davey being just completely anonymous. And all I really know about him is that he thinks women have a penis. And I follow this stuff, and that's all I really know about him. So I think it's to get him out there as a persona, but it's a Boris mayoral style campaign. It's not even an election campaign. It's a London mayor type campaign. But it's actually the one thing I respect him for, because I'd hate to do all that crap. I mean, I absolutely couldn't do that, because I tend to think I could do the speaking, I can get on with people, I speak the common vernacular. I tend to think I could probably do most of it. I'm smart enough.
Couldn't deliberately fall off a paddleboard.
I couldn't fall off a paddle, and I couldn't get on a roller coaster. I just couldn't do all that crap. I remember working in a place once, they said we're doing a go-karting evening, like as a sort of work thing. I just didn't go, and I was in big trouble for just not going. But I will never go go-karting. There's nothing you can do to make me go go-karting. So I would never do all this crap. I mean, this is the stuff. I bet Rishi hates it as well. I mean, Ed Davey's been quite game about it. But this stuff just doesn't suit me. So not that it's about me, but that's the one thing I respect about Ed Davey, is he's prepared to fall off a paddleboard.
Yeah, I'm not like you.
No, you're the exact opposite.
Exactly. So during the early part of my career as a journalist, I did lots of stunts along those lines. Like, I got into trouble much later because I did a piece for an American lad mag, which involved dressing up as a woman to see if I could pull a good-looking lesbian in New York's lipstick lesbian scene.
Different time.
At one point, I had to William Hague, when he had a makeover as leader of the Conservative Party, spent £5,000 on shoes, a new suit, a shirt, so he had a glow up. And they said, here's £100. Go to Oxford Street, see if you can get an identical outfit to William Hague for less than £100. And they photographed me kind of standing, put it next to the Hague picture. I did look a lot like him then.
And you were going to go on that SAS thing, weren't you?
Yeah, simulated the SAS survival course,
and
got lost in a bivouac.
Yeah, that's it. And you nearly died. And then you were going to go on the jungle, but you insulted Ant Dec.
At one point, Nick, I went undercover to get a consultation with a penis enlargement surgeon. And he was one of two Italian twin brothers. And I said, well, just like in Dead Ringers, that Cronenberg film, which Jeremy Irons plays these kind of twin evil gynecologists.
Okay.
And he was really annoyed about that. He said, no, why'd you say this? Everybody say this. Why'd you say this? And then when he measured my todger, he did it with a ruler with centimeters on it rather than inches. I think maybe to kind of soften the blow when he told me what the total length was. And then after he'd kind of pulled it this way and that, and he said, yes, Mr. Young, I think I can help you. And at that point, of course, I knew he was a complete charlatan, not to be taken seriously, because I needed no help at all, Nick.
That's so extraordinary that you would do that. I mean, I suppose you were doing it anyway, presumably, and you thought, may as well get the publicity.
I'd get a free bid.
That is incredible. That is more shocking than all the other stories from the 90s. When was that?
That was in the 90s.
Of course, it was the 90s.
Early 90s.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was it for, ostensibly?
It was for Night and Day, the kind of supplement of the Mail on Sunday.
Wow. Why is it you'll just do anything, Toby? Is it just a desperate need for publicity?
It was a kind of style of journalism. If you were in that kind of bracket back then, you did this kind of stunt journalism. You went off, and it's still a kind of genre, but it's less prevalent now than it was.
Thankfully. I mean, I'm the exact opposite. I mean, people say, like, oh, didn't you do stand-up comedy for 10 years, Nick? I don't know why I said people say it. No one says that to me. But if they did, I would say yes. But what Harry Shearer said about that, I believe, was that a comedian wants to control why people are laughing at him. So, I hate sort of embarrassing things, but I am prepared to go on stage and tell jokes, and the thing most people are terrified of, I am prepared to do that, but not any of the things you just described.
I've got a very high embarrassment threshold.
Yes,
my
disturbingly
kid.
high.
I used to really embarrass my kids, so particularly in the cinema. I don't know if we've told you this before, but when I used to take my children to the cinema to see something like, I don't know, Finding Nemo when they were all tiny, if other families with young kids were making a noise during the film, like eating popcorn or asking their parents questions, or if the toddler burst into tears, I'd be kind of leaning forward going, shh. I was the kind of shushing Nazi in the cinema, and my kids were like, Dad, shut up, Dad, don't say anything. Now, when we're in the cinema watching kind of like, the latest Mission Impossible, and someone in some distant part of the auditorium opens a bag of crisps, all my kids are saying, Dad, he's making a noise, Dad, shush him, go on, Dad, shush him.
Do you do it still?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, that's nothing compared to the whole penis thing. It's fun, isn't it? We're just so opposite in that. You're just unembarrassable. Is that because of sort of autism?
Probably, yeah.
That's a spectrum quality. See, we love our autistic listeners, but that is a spectrum thing. Though I'm probably on it in a different way. It's funny how the spectrum manifests. We need to write in and tell us what's wrong with Toby and Nick.
Should we do the ad?
The ad? Yeah. The only thing is, let's do the ad, but we've got to get to the debates. But maybe we can. Yeah. Do you want to do it after the debate or before? We better do it, I suppose, because otherwise it might not end up in the...
That's true, but let's do it now, and then let's get on to talk about the debates.
Okay.
So this is an ad from Thor Holt. Believe it or not, you can improve your situation remarkably with one choice. Although my client Robert sold his company for $1 billion, money was never his guiding force. His guiding value was steady focus on this one choice. Robert had humble working-class origins, but as he grew from engineer to manager to CEO, and eventual successful exit, he chose to focus on one thing that most avoid due to their fears or discomfort. What was it Robert prioritized? Communicating. Specifically, Robert invested in guidance for public speaking, storytelling, and presenting throughout his career. Why choose to repeatedly put himself through this process? Because, Robert told me, communication confidence and capability, and enjoying it, is a number one priority for winning. From initial promotions to his MBO finance deal to competitive pitch wins with his new venture, and then the market differentiation story which led to his eventual acquisition. Now semi-retired, Robert still refers clients to me at all stages of their careers because he knows they'll enjoy growth in confidence and results with me. To choose your communication focus and enjoy it like Robert did, go to growthpresenter.com for your free confidence call with Thor. That's growthpresenter.com, and we'll put the information on our website and on Podbean as well, so you can find this. It's growthpresenter.com for a free consultation with Thor.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Thor. And we were just talking about communication and public speaking. And so, thanks again to Thor. And but we've got to get on, Toby, because we've got so much to do. So thank you to Thor, but we've got to get on and do the debates. So the 7-way debate. Did you watch the whole thing?
Are we going to go straight to the 7-way? Because I don't think we'd had a chance to talk about the Rishi
the 2-way
Starmer 2-way debate.
The 2-way,
the evening of when we last recorded.
Well, I haven't watched all of the 2-way, and I know I should, but it was quite boring, and I had a lot to do. But I've watched more of the 7-way. Right. But do you want to comment on the 2-way?
It was Rishi apparently thought, after the kind of debacle of Farage deciding he was going to enter the race, run for a seat, lead Reform on Monday, he thought that he'd kind of saved himself with his brilliant performance in the 2-way debate on Tuesday, resurrected his campaign after the blow of Monday night. But Actually, I didn't think he was particularly good. He was just slightly less bad than Starmer. Starmer was awful, wooden, robotic, completely incapable of responding to the kind of curveballs that Rishi threw his way, even things he must have been totally expecting, in fact, like the claim that Labour were going to put taxes up for every UK citizen by £2,000. He didn't respond to that till about 40 minutes in. Rishi had landed that blow 5 or 6 times before Starmer finally got round. It must have been, during the interval, there's an interval after 30 minutes. It was on ITV. They must have said for God's sake, Keir, you've got to respond to that. You can't just let that go. You've got to reply.
He kept saying, didn't he? The bit I saw, he kept saying, I have to reply to that, and I have to, and they never. And then the moderator would say that we have to move on. You can't interrupt him, and blah blah.
Yeah.
And then he kept, I do have to reply to, and eventually, like you say, replied to the tax thing.
Yeah, but
where have you got that?
But it wasn't that he didn't reply to the tax thing for 40 minutes because he'd been trying to before that and the moderator wouldn't let him. It just hadn't occurred to him. Maybe he wasn't listening. I mean, you do find, when you're kind of on a live TV program, sometimes it's quite hard. You're so kind of conscious about getting your points across. You just don't hear what the people around you are saying. But that was clearly what was going on with Starmer. He wasn't engaging, listening, responding. He just let that go.
He basically said it was a made-up figure, and Rishi said it had been independently costed, and Labour said, no, you've done it based on nonsense procedures, and it's not our policy.
All that row was the following day, really, because the Labour were desperate to try and take the sting.
That was in the debate.
I think maybe he finally got around to mentioning after being briefed in the interval.
And then they just came back and said, well, your tax rises will put things up £3,000, which was kind of which is similar to the manifesto. I forgot to mention earlier, but Tories are going to build Labour's going to build 1.5 million homes, and Tories are going to build 1.6 million or something like that. Anyway, so there's a lot of this kind of thing going on.
It was awful. It was embarrassing.
Okay.
And it did make Labour and the Conservatives look like the uniparty. It wasn't really clear what they agreed about, certainly not disagreed about, certainly not fundamentally. There was the only other memorable bit in it was when a questioner, when the moderator said to both of them, if one of your loved ones needed a life-saving operation, would you go private to secure them the best care in the quickest possible time? And Rishi
like,
just
yes.
said yes.
And Simon was like,
and Simon was like, no.
I know.
And then,
I think
extraordinary. I mean, why does he think that's gonna endear him?
It turns out I watched more of this debate than I thought. Yeah, because I saw that as well. And he repeated a claim which he kept saying robotically. It's very saying, it's in my DNA. My wife works for one of the top London NHS hospitals. But he says it every time, and he said it so ridiculous. It was almost parody the amount of times he said that. The way he said, my wife. You don't have to say every time that your wife works in an NHS hospital, because he'd already just said it. And he was like, no. It was almost like he just was learning his character. He was like a sort of an actor learning a part, or a sort of a Martian but pretending to be Keir Starmer. He was like, well, no, I'm Keir Starmer. My wife works in the NHS. Well, why would I do that? He was like trying to figure out what would Keir Starmer say to this. It was like a really weird. Of course, I wouldn't do that because my wife isn't. Answer it in a normal human way. You weirdo.
I think they're kind of over prepared, and they're fed lines by their advisors. They regard themselves as kind of having no natural political gifts at all. Ed Miliband was exactly the same in his debates with David Cameron. David Cameron, at least, was is a more natural debater and communicator than Ed Miliband was, certainly than Rishi is. But it was as though Keir Starmer had just been given these lines and told to repeat them. So he just repeated them robotically ad infinitum, regardless of what Rishi was saying or what the question was. And it just made him seem completely inhuman.
I think I've nailed it there. He was thinking, what would Keir Starmer say to this, even though he is ostensibly Keir Starmer. But that was incredible to me. I mean, that, as Peter Hitchens said, that shows his fanaticism. I was stunned by that. Your loved one's dying and you won't go private, even though you're obviously rich.
Yeah,
I mean,
you'd prefer to watch them die.
That's insane. I mean, that's Corbyn level.
Go private.
I mean, Corbyn was in trouble for saying he wouldn't send them to a better school.
Yeah,
really that caused some trouble in his personal life. Maybe that's wrong, but that's what
that was in his personal life. Yeah, he didn't want to send his kids to
but people thought Corbyn was a zealot who would do that kind of thing. And that's seen as zealous. But you wouldn't save your loved one because you believe in the failing NHS. It's insane.
And one of the it's insane. And one of the crazy things about that argument is, if you're Keir Starmer and you're part of a dual income professional couple, you can afford to go private. How are you harming someone by going private? If you go private, that gives someone on the waiting list an opportunity to be operated on or have some urgent procedure in the NHS. Yeah. You're actually helping people. If you insist on using the NHS, even though you could afford to go private, that's selfish, isn't it? You're depriving someone else of treatment that they can't afford, but which you can.
That does seem the sort of common sense thing, but I have heard an argument that even if you go private, because it's all the same pool of resources, you don't actually take away from the NHS. Have you ever heard that you can't really take pressure off the NHS because they all sort of rely on the same equipment and a lot of the surgeons are working for both and so on. I've heard that that's like a misnomer, but it does seem, I mean, surely it would, in the short term at least, take some pressure off. But it certainly seems crazy that you wouldn't do it. Really, at the heart of that is the leftist ideology, isn't it? It's because we think family first, right? But that's how the normal person thinks. But that's also the small c conservative approach. Whereas the leftist thinks, well, we belong to the state, so the NHS is more important in a sense than my own family, or in a sense, I belong to the NHS more than I belong to my family, or something sick like that.
And his hands are tied now. You know, if one of his children, gets some, God forbid, some nasty disease and needs urgent treatment, and there's the waiting list at the NHS to get that treatment is 6 months. He can't go private now. 6
years, you'd think, they still probably will, but that is.
Tony Blair said the opposite, incidentally. He was asked the same question. He said, no, I'd go private. And in that case, all these other cabinet ministers lined up behind him and said, yes, so would I. So he wouldn't look as though he was like out of touch and different. In this case, all the cabinet, the shadow cabinet, rode in behind Starmer and said, yeah, we would never go private either.
Just shows how odd we've gone, because Blair had that steely pragmatism where he probably did nurture these lefty ideas, but he was more than anything, he wanted to win and be pragmatic. Whereas Starmer, you wonder with an answer like that, does he still hold on to these Pabloite ideas, as Hitchens is always pointing out? He was part of this subset of Trotskyism. He was a radical leftist. Or is he just, as you say, sort of trying to say the Starmer-esque thing? But I thought that was bonkers. And it'd be as absurd for Rishi to say it, so he did the right thing not saying it. But yeah, that was crazy. And what else was there? That was a big one from the debate. So you want to move on to this? I forgot what I was going to say. So we may as well do the 7-way debate. I was going to add one thing, but I've forgotten. Doesn't matter. The 7-way was more interesting because you had Farage in there with a completely anti-Farage audience. I mean, it was absurd the amount of how anti-Farage. Yeah. Then we kept cutting to some lad going, shaking his head. There was one of these, hope she sees this, bro. Like, terrible. Every time it cut to this, people were like, well, who's this kid? Where's he come from? And it was one of these ridiculous BBC audiences taken from a diverse range of people in the BBC canteen that day. I mean, who knows where they came from? But it was absurd because Farage, it must have been tough for him. He's used to getting a good response. Everything he was saying. All right, that is the end of the free podcast for this week. But don't worry, there's still loads more podcasts. If you go to basedmedia.org and sign up for just £5 a month, that's the price of a pint in London or a posh coffee with loads of soy that you don't need. So basedmedia.org for the whole podcast, and you get Peak Woke, Base Department, all these great sections, and you help us keep going, pay all our staff, keep the lights on, keep this brilliant production going at basedmedia.org, and it's just £5. Thank you very much for the support, and we'll see you there.